minute. So the topic, the title is Measuring Outcomes That Matter to Patients, pivoting to patient-focused drug development in COPD and other chronic lung diseases. And really, I think this title hopefully is a representation of what the topics will be today or the focus. Certainly, we will be focusing on outcomes that matter to patients. You'll notice pivot is actually in capitals because not only are we using it as a verb in the title, it's also the name, the acronym for the project that we'll be talking about. And we'll be very much focusing on patient-focused drug development, which is a regulatory framework from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States that we've used as a guiding light for the pivot project. I'll be specifically talking about the work that we're doing in COPD, but certainly the concepts that I'll be describing very much apply to other chronic lung diseases and actually to diseases in general. So just by a little bit more of an introduction of myself and my co-presenter, Sanaa Alsubheen, who's here in front of me. So as Aaron said, I am currently Senior Director of Research at the COPD Foundation. I've been there for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was 25 years in the pharmaceutical industry as a clinical scientist. And actually, it's really good to come back to McMaster because many years ago, I did my graduate and postdoctoral studies at McMaster. And I'm joined in my presentation today by Dr. Sanaa Alsubheen, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the HEI department. And she actually is the holder of the COPD Foundation postdoctoral fellowship. And this is actually Sanaa's second postdoc fellowship at McMaster. Previous to the current one, she had a postdoctoral fellowship in, I believe it was Department of Rehabilitation Sciences with Dr. Dina Brooks. So just to give a little bit of scene setting for what we'll be talking about today, is really founded on a very common question in clinical research and clinical trials: does the therapy work? And I put in brackets that what we're trying to do with the pivot program is focus on chronic lung disease, but some of the concepts that we'll be describing today very much do apply to other diseases as well. And I thought, just to set the scene a little bit, give what I call a tale of two therapies. Now, one is bronchodilator, so a drug therapy, very common as a therapeutic option in COPD. To improve lung function. But the other one is not a drug therapy. It's a non-pharmacological therapy, exercise training, which is a very key component to pulmonary rehab. And the exercise training component of pulmonary rehab is intended to improve muscle function. Now, if we look at one of the traditional endpoints that is used in the regulatory environment in clinical trials for the evaluation of efficacy, FEV1, a measure of lung function, this has certainly been a mainstay of the regulatory approvals for many bronchodilators over the year. And so that becomes primary proof of efficacy for bronchodilators. But if we look at exercise training has very good efficacy when it comes to patient outcomes such as breathlessness and activity limitation, but it actually doesn't have any effect on FEV1. It's not intended to have an effect on lung function or FEV1. So I put at the bottom there, well, thank goodness pulmonary rehab is not a drug, because if it was, it may not have passed the regulatory approval process and wouldn't be available as a therapy. But I actually put that as a question mark, because in some ways where we are today with evaluation of therapies or treatments in COPD is we've almost been victims of our own success, because FEV1 has been such a valuable endpoint for evaluation of bronchodilators, and there haven't been other treatment options looking at other mechanisms of action. Maybe we've gone a little bit too long with relying on FEV1 as the sole measure of efficacy. And really, that's what we're going to be talking about today is, in the future, is there an avenue to be had for looking at some of these other endpoints more related to what patients consider to be relevant to their everyday experience? And so I've just modified the question a little bit. So does the therapy work? That's really the conclusion that we are trying to draw from the evidence from clinical trials. But I said, is there a relatively new way of thinking? Because what we're trying to do is build on some of the work that has been done before with regard to patient relevant outcomes. And so an alternative way of phrasing the question is, does the therapy have an effect on patient relevant outcomes? Now, as I said, we are building on the past, and I could have taken a quote from a Canadian environment, such as from the SPOR group, the strategy for patient outcome research, but I've taken one from the US, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which I think is very relevant to what we are talking about today. I'll just say a quote that comes from their methodology committee. Researchers often choose questions and outcomes that they consider interesting and important, but sometimes these are not the questions and outcomes that are most relevant to people who need information. Certainly that very much applies to what we're doing with Pivot. But you notice at the top, I have said in brackets, asking all the right questions. So we're not saying that the questions that have been asked in the past are not relevant questions, but we are questioning ourselves whether we're asking all the right questions. And that's really where we hope to move with Pivot, is to bring more of a patient relevant focus to some of the outcome measures in clinical trials. So with that as a scene setter, just to give you a little bit of agenda, what myself will be and Sanaa will be talking about today. So I'll be just three main topics. I'll be giving a little bit of an understanding of who the COPD Foundation is. It is a US patient organization. I know I'm in a Canadian environment, so that not everybody will be familiar with the COPD Foundation potentially. Also want to then dive into a little bit of patient-focused drug development, PFDD as we call it, which is a recent initiative by the United States Food and Drug Administration. But I will also try to show that it's not just relevant to the US regulatory environment, but actually we believe is going to have global consequences to the future of the drug development and clinical trials process. And then I'll give a little bit of information of what Pivot is, just right now to say that Pivot stands for Patient-Inspired Validation of Outcome Tools. And it is a framework, a program. And what I'll be talking about today is one very important foundational part of Pivot, which is the development of a unified set of patient-inspired health concepts as a representation of treatment benefit in patients with COPD. And when I've done that, I'm hoping to keep going for about another 15, 20 minutes. And then Sanaa will take over and she will provide you with a preliminary look at some of the work she's been doing with a systematic review of randomized controlled trials over the last few years in COPD, to give us a sense of what types of outcome measures are being used currently in evaluation of treatments for COPD. So a couple of minutes spent on COPD Foundation and who we are as the COPD Foundation. It's actually 20 years. We actually just celebrated our 20th anniversary, or we are celebrating this year our 20th anniversary. COPD is a US non-for-profit organization. And the mission of the COPD Foundation as a patient advocacy group is to help millions of people live longer and healthier lives by advancing research, advocacy, and awareness to stop COPD, bronchiectasis, and NTM lung disease. And I've shown three individuals that were extremely important in the history of the foundation. These are the co-founders. And I wanted to show these individuals because I think that's at the heart of what the COPD Foundation wants to achieve within the realm of research. Because what you see there is, just looking at my side, left to right, we have Dave Menino, John Walsh, and Byron Thomashaw. These were the co-founders. The gentleman in the middle was John Walsh. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but he was a patient and a patient advocate. And his idea was really to bring different stakeholders together, importantly, patients and clinical scientists working together collaboratively to advance towards a better life for patients with COPD. And so Dave Menino and Byron Thomashaw are extremely well-established key leaders in the field of COPD. And so very much at the start of the COPD Foundation journey was this idea of collaboration between patients and clinician scientists in order to advance research. I won't be talking about the advocacy and the education awareness part of the COPD Foundation. What I'll be focusing on today is what we hope to achieve within our research framework. This is just a little excerpt from our website to show just a high level what our view is of the COPD Foundation research framework. So what we hope to achieve is to have a strategic alignment of goals of all COPD Foundation stakeholders. And who do we mean by stakeholders? We mean patients, healthcare professionals, caregivers, academic colleagues, government, advocacy groups, and industry partners. And our mission within the research framework is to ensure a central role for the patient and caregiver in all stages of research. And we have this little figure, which is certainly a nice figure. And I think probably there are many of these figures around to get the idea of patient centricity, where we have all the stakeholders all focused on the patient in the middle. I think that that figure doesn't do full justice to what we're trying to achieve, because we also want to go beyond that, not have the patient in the middle as a passive anchor, but rather being an active, and that's why we center role, an active contributor, integrating all the views of the various stakeholders with the patient centricity in mind. And so that's really from that how Pivot has developed, and what we are hoping to achieve with Pivot, and Pivot's been around for a couple of years now. We're hoping that through Pivot, a patient organization such as the COPD Foundation will be able to be a contributing driving force for integrating the patient voice into outcome measurements in chronic lung disease. And so with that, a little bit of information on COPD Foundation and what we hope to achieve with Pivot, I want to now turn the attention to the FDA and the regulatory environment, and a recent initiative, fairly recent initiative of the last few years by the FDA on patient-focused drug development. And we have looked at this from the lens of Pivot, and we see in the regulatory environment the possibility of a new paradigm for the future. And when we have thought about that and how it aligns with Pivot, we really see this as an opportunity to leverage on some of the work being done in that initiative, which can very much be a foundational grounding for what we're doing in Pivot. And I've just highlighted there what is the intention of the patient-focused drug development guidance series, and I'll go into those guidances a little bit more in a couple of minutes. But it really is to enhance the incorporation of the patient voice in medical product development and regulatory decision-making. So very much aligned with what we are trying to achieve in Pivot. And while certainly the FDA, it's a US regulatory institution, body, I wanted to also show, because I have a Canadian audience here, that the likelihood is that this doesn't just apply to the US. The International Conference of Harmonization, ICH, which is a global regulatory institution, it has conducted a reflection or written a reflection paper. And I think we can hope to see in a couple of years' time that the guidance series that currently resides within the FDA will actually be incorporated globally as a way forward for patient-focused drug development across all countries, including Canada. And so patient-focused drug development is an initiative. There is a department in the FDA, the PFDD department, and within that initiative, they have over recent years written or developed 4 guidance, a series, because they're now complete guidance series. The first 2 are actually signed off. The last 2 are in draft form and open for comments at the moment. I'll focus on the ones in orange today. The last one is more kind of downstream of specific endpoints, classification or selection within clinical trials. But what I'll be focusing on is the first 3 guidances. And what's been very useful in terms of terminology and concepts within these guidances is this separation between the what to measure and the how to measure. And to really make it clear that in the future, we should pay a lot more attention to clearly establishing and identifying what we should be measuring before we jump to the instruments, the measurement instruments, and how to measure those things that we have defined to be measured. The first 2 are very much on within the realm of qualitative research, and the third one is very specific to the selection, development, and modification of clinical outcome assessments. So just give a little bit of an overview of what these guidances are. So the first one is, again, within the realm of qualitative research, and I quite like the way they've introduced these guidances by putting very simple questions. And the first question that they say is fundamental to the first guidance is, from whom do you get input and why? So how do you collect the information from patients, patient experience data? And I think very importantly within this guidance, they talk about the pros and cons of different sampling methods for engaging and collecting patient input. And they also talk about representativeness. So when we gather that data, really being clear on the extent of the total population of patients that the information, patient experience data actually represents. The second guidance is then moving from, once you've collected the data, once you have the methods for collecting it, how are you actually going to collect that data? So it really asks the question of what do you ask patients, and how do you ask non-leading questions that are well understood by a wide range of patients? I think very important through this document is this notion of best practices in conducting qualitative research. So that certainly is something that we are drawing out of that in terms of how we move forward with Pivot, is making sure that when we are actually reaching out to patients, engaging with patients and understanding their lived experience, we do that with methodology that would be considered to be high quality qualitative research. And the third guidance is really central to what we are doing with Pivot, because it is how do you decide what to measure in a clinical trial and select or develop fit for purpose clinical outcome assessments or COAs. So very much about selecting what to measure in a medical product development program and identifying or developing fit for purpose, which is a term that the FDA uses for meaning validated COAs to assess outcomes of importance to patients. Just checking the time here. So with that as an introduction to PFDD, I wanted to then just give an overall statement of what we hope to achieve in Pivot, what Pivot is. Now, Pivot is not so much a thing, but rather a way of thinking. It's a framework. And so the way that we describe Pivot is it's a patient-centric framework for coordination of activities for the development and validation of biomarkers and clinical outcome assessments for use in the evaluation of treatment benefit for pharmacological and non-pharmacological therapeutic approaches in COPD, bronchiectasis, and other chronic lung diseases. Long sentence. I just wanted to draw a couple of important points, those in orange, which are central to how we are moving forward with Pivot. So certainly patient-centric, that is extremely important. That's what we mean by the patient-inspired in the Pivot acronym. The validation of biomarkers and clinical outcome assessments, that certainly we are in the methodology of validating measurement tools. We are very interested in clinical outcome assessments, but we are also interested in biomarkers from the point of measurement instruments that might not be considered clinical outcome assessment, but we still need to be able to show the relationship between those biomarkers and things that matter to patients in their everyday experience. And then I'll go on the next slide in terms of what we mean by evaluation of treatment benefit. And this is actually extremely important for us in Pivot. And it's a foundational definition of treatment benefit, which is really our guiding light to how we are proceeding with Pivot. Set at the top there, treatment benefit. Another way of saying that is a term that is really started to grab hold in the regulatory environment is this notion of feels, functions, survives. Now, what won't be saying too much about survives, we're tending to focus more on the feels and functions. But certainly, if we look at a paper that was written a few years ago by the ICE4 task force on clinical outcome assessments, and the little references at the bottom, they came up with a very good and valuable definition of treatment benefit, which they said a conclusion that a therapy is effective means there is a treatment benefit. And they can define a treatment benefit as a favorable effect on a meaningful aspect of how a patient feels or functions in their usual or typical life. I've just put in brackets or on their survival because we won't be focusing on that today. They also go on, though, to dive a little bit deeper into a couple of these very important words. So meaningful means that the patient cares about it and the patient has a preference that this aspect does not become worse or becomes improved or is prevented. And then on the side of functions in their usual or typical life, extremely important that to establish a well-understood relationship of the measurement to the patient's usual life, it's central to the conclusion that observed effect is actually a treatment benefit. So we've really, if you like, internalized that definition of treatment benefit, and it's really a guiding light for us in how we are proceeding with Pivot. So I'd now like to go back to the PFDD guidances and actually focus on guidance 3, because in guidance 3, they've actually provided what we found to be an extremely useful roadmap, what they call a roadmap to patient-focused outcome measurement in clinical trials. Busy slide, but I won't go through the whole slide, but just to show what they've done is they've separated the first part of the roadmap, which is the conceptual model, and the second part, which is the measurement model. And this really fits into everyday terms of saying, let's separate the what to measure and the how to measure. And importantly, let's focus attention on the what to measure before we start talking about how to measure things. And within the conceptual model, they talk about health concepts. Now, there's a lot of variable terminology that's used in this field. I'm sure many in the audience are aware. They've used the term health concepts. It could also be termed meaningful aspect of health. It can also be termed outcomes. We're tending to use that term health concepts. And they gave some ideas of what that might be. So patients in the target population have a variety of specific health experiences that may be affected by the disease or condition, symptoms, behaviors, activities. And so really, the idea of the roadmap is that through qualitative studies with patients, as well as with clinical expertise, these symptoms, behaviors, and activities can be documented and summarized under one or more health concepts that name the relevant symptoms, signs, and effects. So it's really from a thematic analysis point of view, taking the statements from the patients about their lived experience and finding common themes which we can categorize under specific health concepts. And that's very central to the first part of what we're doing with Pivot, which is to move towards a set of patient-inspired health concepts. And we've set a unified set because we believe that going forwards, we need to make sure all stakeholders are looking at the same anchor, if you like, which will help in terms of moving forward to how to measure. And so what we're hoping to achieve, to be able to do is, first of all, go to the patients, understand the patient lived experience, a representative model of lived experience, go back to patients and validate that model of lived experience, and through that, be able to come up with a set of patient-inspired health concepts. So these are health concepts that are coming or being drawn from the patient, and then go out to the other stakeholders that I talked about in the first few slides, and then show those health concepts to other stakeholders and engage in discussion so that ultimately we can come to a point where we all stakeholders have a unified set of health concepts as a foundational, what we would call a North Star for measurement in clinical trials. And so just to, in my final couple of minutes before I hand over to Sanaa, just to go through, I think, a very important aspect of the roadmap and how that fits into this idea of set of health concepts. What I'm showing here is another figure from the PFDD guidance number 3, which is intended to show a mechanistic model within a conceptual framework. So if you, as you notice in the green, I've highlighted this health concept. So these are the health, this is what we would say is the set of health concepts. But you'll notice that moving from left to right, there's nothing on symptom A. There's only symptom B, the behaviors associated with symptom B and function A. And we have some measurement instruments developed for those health concepts. But without symptom A, this is what we would call a mechanistic model. So this is where, when you have an intervention of choice, a specific intervention, this is how that intervention would navigate through the health concepts to be able to decide which are the specific measurement instruments to be used in the clinical trial. And we believe that's extremely valuable. But if you like, before that, we believe it's really important that we have a holistic understanding of what all of the full set of health concepts that are important to patients is. So what I've done is I've just tried to take a little bit out of the slide to show how we hope to move forward. So for the first part, we definitely will follow the guidances. Then we want to come up with then these specific set of health concepts. And from those, in a product agnostic way, then determine and validate available COAs. So in COPD, for sure, there are a multitude of measurement instruments available. So we're not at first looking to develop new instruments, but rather looking at the instruments that are currently available and seeing to what extent and validating to what extent they are fit for purpose in measuring those health concepts that have been identified in this health concept set. Now, I think this last slide is very important from what we're doing. And I just want to go back to this slide. So here we have health concepts, symptom A, so that may be breathlessness, symptom B might be fatigue. We don't want to just rest at that high level. And I think that's really important that once we've identified at the high level what these health concepts are, we then want to really do another deeper dive into what we would call health concept attributes. And this is an excerpt from the PFDD guidance, talking about different aspects of the concept, such as frequency, intensity, or duration, and making sure that we've clearly and rigorously described that health concept and dimensions of that health concept as a primary foundation for then making sure that the measurement instruments are truly fit for purpose. And so I'm going to finish with the last couple of slides. And this slide is a slide that, for me, is very relevant in where we hope to ultimately get to. it's a slide, it's an illustration that myself and a very important strategic collaborator of mine, Nancy Leidy, we often use this in thinking about what are we ultimately trying to achieve. We don't have something tangible at the moment to achieve. So what is it? Where do we want to get to? And this, I think, is a nice illustration to say that what we hope to do is, on the one hand, have a unified set of health concepts meaningful to patients that all stakeholders gravitate towards as foundational. And then we'll have a list of outcome tools. Hopefully, many of those will already be developed, but maybe we have to suggest future development. But ultimately, we want to have the situation where each of those health concepts has a relevant outcome tool that is fit for purpose for measurement of that health concept. And so where are we right now? We have completed the initial part of the journey of Pivot with doing finding out what is already known about the lived experience. And so with COPD Foundation strategic collaboration partner, Evadera, we have completed a qualitative literature review on the patient experience. So drawing out from the last 10 years, all the qualitative research that is pertinent to the lived experience of patients with COPD, and through a meta-synthesis synthetic analysis using what is considered to be, I think, one of the Bibles, if you like, of synthesizing qualitative research by Sanaa Alsubheen and Barasto. We're hoping as a starting point to really have a rich, rigorous understanding of what is currently known about the lived experience. And from that, we'll be able to move on to develop or understand what health concepts are those that matter to patients. And maybe we'll also find some gaps in the qualitative literature for further research. And so with that, I'd like to pass over to my colleague, Sanaa, who will provide you with some preliminary results of her work on a systematic review. And maybe, Aaron, do you want to help switch over? It's on the desktop.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Aaron. So again, my name is Sanaa, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow working in the HEI department. Today, I'm presenting my systematic review on the evaluation of outcome measures of pharmaceutical phase 3 randomized clinical trials in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So we are investigating what is being measured in the last 5 years. So to start with is the recent definition of COPD as by the Global Initiative for Chronic Lung Disease, who defines COPD as a heterogeneous lung condition characterized by chronic respiratory symptoms due to abnormalities of the airways or the alveoli that causes persistent airflow obstruction. The global prevalence of COPD is estimated to be 10.6% in the year 2020 and is expected to increase by 23.3% by the year 2050. The current pharmacological standard of care for patients with COPD, including LAMAs, LABAs, and ICEs, and the intervention with these drugs is escalated from mono to dual to triple therapy based on the frequency or severity of symptoms and exacerbations. Several systematic reviews of phase 3 RCTs review the efficacy and effectiveness of these pharmacological drugs, and they reported a significant reduction in the annual rate of exacerbations and mortality rates, in addition to improved lung function, respiratory symptoms, and health status in patients with COPD. So why phase 3? Phase 3 RCTs consider the confirmatory studies that provide high quality evidence on the clinical usefulness of medical products. Also, phase 3 are a prerequisite for approving any new drug or medical product by the regulatory authorities. So the selection of the primary and secondary endpoints in these phase 3 trials is critical to grant the regulatory approval for the new medical products. So a recent report from the ATS-ERS task force highlighted the vast number of outcome measures used in COPD RCTs, which limiting the interpretation of treatment effects of outcomes. And they also highlighted the need for new outcome measures to evaluate the treatment effect for the new emergent therapies while focusing on a clinically meaningful treatment effect. They also emphasize the need for a patient-centered approach in COPD to focus on or to create an inspired core outcome sets for patients with COPD. So as Alan introduced, Pivot as the initiative aims to develop patient-inspired core outcome sets or PICOS, which will represent the outcomes that is matter most to patients with COPD. And the foundational pivot will be the concept of the treatment benefit, which Alan also has explained in details, which focus on how a patient feels and function in their typical life. So also, the FDA recommends the use of fit-for-purpose COAs to assess the treatment benefit of a treatment product. COAs is the clinical outcome assessment, and it is necessary to be identified in order to assess the concept of the treatment benefit. So why we need the systematic review? This systematic review focuses on phase 3 RCTs because phase 3 RCTs use outcome and outcome measurement instrument to provide evidence for the treatment effects. They also can support a conclusion on the treatment benefit on meaningful aspects that matter most to patients. As no previous systematic review have examined the variability of outcomes and the OMI used in phase 3 pharmaceutical RCTs, we are going to identify and synthesize a list of outcomes and OMI used to assess the efficacy of pharmacological therapies in COPD, and examine to what extent have these RCTs be within the concept of treatment benefit. So we conducted this systematic review was conducted based on the PRISMA, following the PRISMA guidelines, and it is being registered on the online Prospero website. We searched for academic academic databases, including Medline, Embase, MCare, and Central. And like our inclusion criteria were phase 3 RCTs of pharmacological therapies in COPD, which were published in peer-reviewed journals in English and in the last 5 years. I screened and abstract the full text of the eligible studies, and the final inclusion of studies were discussed with the senior authors of the systematic reviews until a consensus was reached. So to achieve the first aim of this systematic review, which is synthesize a list of outcomes and outcome measures used in COPD, we first extracted the outcomes with their definition verbatim from the identified articles. We then grouped outcomes with similar definitions into one group, and then we used COMET taxonomy to classify these outcome and the outcome measures. OCOMET covers 5 core areas and 37 domains. And then we calculated the frequency of outcomes and the outcome measure instruments per trial and across trials. And to achieve the second aim, which we are still working on, we aim to identify and classify COAs, the clinical outcome assessments, and then sub-classify them into patient-reported outcomes, clinician-reported outcomes, performance reported outcomes, and lastly, the observant reported outcomes. We will also calculate the percentage of use of COAs and compare it to the percentage of use of other OMI to find how much these RCTs were within the concept of the treatment benefit. So it's like this is the PRISMA for the initial search for these studies. So we ended up did the systematic study selection process of the published literature. We ended up with 149 publications of phase 3 RCTs. These RCTs included some primary and some secondary reports for old RCTs that were published a long time ago. So because we focused only on the most recent RCTs, we also set up additional criteria focusing on or restricting our research to RCTs with primary reports only in the last 5 years. We excluded phase 3B RCTs, and we restrict to RCTs with 6 weeks of duration or more. So we ended up with 26 phase 3 RCT that were included in our analysis. The time frame ranged from 6 to 56 weeks. The sample size also ranged from 158 to 10,355 participants with COPD. The number of assessed outcomes ranged from 6 to 33 outcomes per trial. The most assessed primary endpoint were trough, FEV1, and the annual rate of exacerbation. And the most tested drug was a combination of THEO, which is the LABA drug combination. So based on the COMET taxonomy, we found that in our classification, we covered the 5 areas and only 11 domains from COMET. And the physiological clinical core area was the most assessed, followed by the adverse events. This graph shows the core area and the corresponding domain. So the most, again, core area and domain that were assessed is adverse events, followed by respiratory lung function, exacerbation and symptoms. It's like all under the respiratory domain. And then for the life impact, we covered perceived health status, physical function, delivery of care, and global quality of life. For mortality, we covered we found only 4 trials that covered the core area of death. And for the resource use core area, we covered 2 domains, the hospital and the economic outcomes. So we ended up with 66 unique outcomes, and 25 among these 66 were used to assess respiratory domain, including the lung function, respiratory symptoms, and exacerbations. And 8 different outcomes were used to assess lung function. So with this graph, I aim to show you the wide variation of the outcomes that we identified, and also the analysis that is associated with each outcome. For example, under lung function, we identified, so these are only examples, but we have more of these outcomes, but these were the most common reported. So FEV1, for example, were tested in 24 trials and were analyzed in many different ways. Like they either analyzed peak FEV1, trough, post-dose, pre-dose, we mean the pre-bronchodilator result, the post-bronchodilator results. The same applies for the other outcomes. So there was a wide variety of outcomes and the way how they analyzed and approached each outcome. For the OMI, we identified 33 outcome measurement instruments. Spirometry was the most used, and it was used to assess lung function in 20 RCTs. 16 RCTs used these GRQ to assess health-related quality of life, health status. Like I meant by this sub-classification to show you also the variability in the terminology used for the outcome that is being assessed with the same instrument. So, and this, we wanted to highlight that it's important not only to identify the OMI and the COAs, but also to unify the terms that is used to assess to be assessed using that specific instrument. So to answer the second question of this review, we are still working on classifying the included OMI to identify COAs, to sub-classify them. And because we know that our COAs is going to provide insights into the type and the extent of change that is meaningful to patients, which represent the treatment benefit of medical product or a drug. One limitation that we wanted to acknowledge that we may not have identified all outcomes using these RCTs because non-significant results of outcomes tend to be not published. And then we hope with this systematic review to assist pivot and like to inform pivot but in the process of developing the PCOS. And as we showed that there was a wide range of outcomes used in COPD, phase 3 RCTs, and hoping that by developing, because that we will provide, that PCOS will provide a standardized reference point for scientists to select outcomes and OMI for clinical trials of patients with COPD. These are the references, and I would like to acknowledge the funding that is being supported by the COPD Foundation, and all authors declare no conflict of interest. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sanaa. I think we do have a little bit of time for questions. Now, we have a limited audience live for those on Zoom. Probably not going to get too many questions from the crowd here. But if there are any questions online, Aaron, are you able to see questions? Would it be do it in the chat?
I think it's fine. I think folks mute themselves and ask or in the chat. They wouldn't have heard that.
Oh, they would have heard. Okay, sorry. Just relaying them from that. So for those online, you could either ask questions in the chat, and I think Aaron, then you'd be able to kind of repeat what the question is. But if you want to unmute yourself, you could also ask questions verbally yourself. So we'll give it a couple of minutes, see if anybody has any questions for those online.
It sort of relates to what both are talking about, and that's specifically thinking about the ways in which these outcomes are analyzed in trials. Specifically think about how you define an outcome, something that has a meaningful effect to the patient. It's when you get around to actually analyzing whether it's a severity score or quality of life measurement. Is there a thought about the study actually your own work has been on whether or not this sort of responder analysis, you're looking at the proportion of people who have this sort of meaningful effect versus the continuous measure is, I just want to get a from a statistical perspective, responder analysis is often from.
Yeah, actually it's very relevant to the fourth guidance, and that's a little bit down the road. So you have the series of 4 guidances from patient-focused drug development. And a lot of that fourth guidance is actually talking about, at least from the FDA's perspective, on clinically important difference or MCID, and also talk about continuous versus responder. Certainly, and I think it's not just. I think importantly though, while it is the FDA's perspective, I think they have certainly, I think, reached out to the academic community to understand what is the current status of I guess, interpretation of whether the difference is clinically meaningful. I think that there is this sense of not moving too much towards a singular threshold point. So they tend to look at more cumulative, I think, I can't remember what they call it, cumulative distribution, where you're looking at various thresholds. So it's a little bit, probably, it's in between kind of a continuous and a categorical dichotomist.
Yeah, that's a nice way to look at your actual plot of distribution. And also, and this is not really my area, but you would think that we talk about a single, clinical point difference, but what if individually people have different thresholds for themselves? They might be reporting. You're not going to know that. Looking at the multiple thresholds to give you a better sense of that.
Yeah. So I think definitely that will be something. And that will be part of our validation process. That's a little bit down the road in terms of what we'll be doing with Pivot. We want to get the set of health concepts identified first. Some of that we already know, though, what some of these health concepts will be. Certainly breathlessness, activity limitation. Now we want to go a little bit deeper into that, and not just leave it at breathlessness, but contextualize that in terms of how is breathlessness impacting on their everyday life. But once we do that, certainly we'll then be looking at if we just take breathlessness, for example, there's a recent review that was conducted looking at the available outcome measurement instruments for breathlessness in COPD. And there's a multitude of them just for breathlessness. So the question there is, are they all measuring specifically the same thing? They all say they're measuring breathlessness, or some of them will say they're measuring dyspnea, not breathlessness. And so there is that, are we talking about the same term? Are we talking about something different concept? But what we want to do is then look, for example, at breathlessness, at all those various ones and say, are they measuring the same thing? Are they measuring something different? And are they measuring all of the aspects of breathlessness that are identified by patients? And through that validation process, there would definitely be this notion of what represents a clinically meaningful difference for that specific scale. Oh, that's nice. Okay, so it doesn't look like there's any comments coming up in the chat, and I think we'll maybe give it a few more seconds. So if anybody has any questions, by all means, just add them to the chat. I'm just looking at Aaron to see if anything's coming. Doesn't look like it. So I think with that, maybe thank you for everybody for your attention. I'm going to hand over maybe to Aaron just to finish off the presentation.
Yeah, I don't actually have anything to say other than to thank our speakers today. And this meeting it has been recorded, and it will be posted online on the departmental YouTube page if you would like to review it or forward it to anyone else who may be interested. So otherwise, thank you for attending today, and have a great rest of your day.